I'm going live on YouTube, and we'll just say hello very quickly. I recognize many of the names out there. It's good to see you all in the audience. Again, my name is Gabe. Sorry, YouTube went live over here while I was chatting. Very professional. I'm like watching myself in kind of mirror and like 3 seconds behind. It's kind of very distracting. All right. Anyway, welcome to this event. I'm going to really just throw it over to Tracy in a minute here, but I just wanted to say hello and welcome you all to Wendy's Subway's virtual space. We're really excited to be hosting this with Litmus, and we're going to be opening again soon our space, the library. So I hope that you'll all keep an eye out for that and stop by if you're in town in Brooklyn. We'd love to see you, say hello, celebrate the end of this wild year, or at least some respite from it. Thank you all for being here. Tracy?
Yes, and I'm going to do a very quick intro and pass it along as well. But I just thank you to Wendy's Subway for co-hosting this book launch. And thank you all for being here. And Hossein, Olivia, Teresa, just it's such a pleasure. And it's been such a wonderful collaborative project pulling this book together. And I hope we can talk a bit about that afterward. There is a Q&A if anybody in the audience wants to add questions as we go, or at the end we can pull questions from there, and I think we'll have some time for discussion. I've invited Amanda Monti to introduce the event today. Amanda is a cross-disciplinary poet and performance artist, and has been working with us at Litmus as editorial assistant and collaborator, and has been working on this book as well. So Amanda, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everyone. And I apologize for an echo in my surrounding. I'm in a studio space, and maybe we can just imagine that we're all in the church together, the Church of Literature. But anyway, I'm very excited to introduce this event today. Thank you, like Tracy said, for being here to help us celebrate this super exciting new publication. And I also want to thank Wendy's Subway for co-hosting this launch event, and I want to thank in advance our readers, who I will introduce after a few words about the book. So, Clamor is a translation by Olivia C. Harrison and Teresa Villa-Ignacio of Hossein Tanjawi's semi-autobiographical prose poem, Clamor, which was first published by 180 Edition in 2017. In the recently released Litmus Press edition of Clamor, these texts are co-presented in English and in French, along with a new preface by the author, and afterward by the translators, and a discography of the music that saturates the text. In the foreword to the English edition, Tanjawi writes, quote, "Nothing is harder than living and identifying as a survivor, especially if one was born in a colony, Algeria, that quickly became a country on the path to decolonization, with all its dramas of injustice and cruelty, with its untethered violence. I was not even 5 years old when the war broke out outside my window." In Clamor, Tanjawi sifts the violence of decolonization in the Algerian War of Independence from France, telling the story from the rarely heard perspective of a child. Set against the backdrop of war and revolution, Clamor also offers an account of the colonial soundscape and a dazzling poetic evocation of the author's discovery of African American music, jazz, soul, rhythm, and blues broadcast on the radio during his childhood in colonized Algeria. Quote, "The clamor of the world, unleashed by the city's loudspeakers and the omnipresent radio, assailed me night and day, took possession of me, led me to discover music, its sounds, its notes, its melodies, all the musical genres in their infinite variety." End quote. Captivated by the voices of Black American vocalists singing of love, pain, and hope, or what Tanjawi describes as arias colored by grief, the soundtrack of Black liberation movements in the US becomes the sounding board of decolonization in Algeria. That the rhythms of violence and hope transgress the meaning of national borders makes sense for, as Tanjawi writes, quote, "All wars are civil wars, all wars are fratricidal wars," end quote. A gorgeously written and translated book, Clamor, reckons with the music and the voices of artists of the African diaspora that rise above the din of war, giving testimony to the transnational solidarities forged across the decolonizing world in the 1950s and 60s. Today, it is an immense pleasure for Litmus Press to celebrate this book in true stereo channels, with our readers offering both the original French as well as the English translations. But before we hear from them, I also want to say a few words about our readers. Born in 1949 in Algeria, Hossein Tanjawi did not go to war, but war came to him. In the singular experience of a country's transformation from colonial rule to a sovereign nation dominated by dictators, he almost became a teacher, but turned to journalism instead, which led him to the theater. After a tour in France as an actor and theater company manager, he decided to cross over to the West and has lived in France since 1972, working in sustainable development and pursuing his passion for reading and writing literature. As a fiction writer, he works with archival sources to recuperate and expand narratives of colonial experience that have been obfuscated by the ideology of global neoliberalism and its attendant historical discourses. This method also informs his prose poem, Clamor. He lives in Paris. Olivia C. Harrison is the author of Transcolonial Maghreb, Imagining Palestine in the Era of Decolonization, and with Teresa Villa Ignacio, co-editor of Soufflé and Fa, a critical anthology from the Moroccan Journal of Culture and Politics. Her translations include essays and poems by Abdelkebir Khatibi, Jacques Hassoun, Abdelatif Labi, and Abraham Serfati. She teaches at the University of Southern California. In addition to her work on the Soufflé and Fa anthology, Teresa Villa Ignacio has contributed translations to Modern Art in the Arab World, Primary Documents, and For an Ineffable Metrics of the Desert, the selected poems of the Moroccan poet Mostafa Nisaburi. She teaches at Stonehill College and is completing a monograph entitled Translational Poetics, Post-Lyric French American Communities Since World War II. Today, we are thrilled to have these three exceptional voices meet through Clamor. Like Tracy said, our reading will be followed by a brief discussion, so please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function, both throughout the reading and after, for comments, reflections, and questions. And with that, please welcome our readers.
Thank you. So, je vais commencer par dire quelques mots de l'histoire du livre, de l'histoire de ce texte. En fait, c'est arrivé suite à quelque chose de banal qui est une fin de repas où beaucoup de gens se sont mis à chanter, moi aussi. On était une dizaine de personnes. Et comme moi je chantais, je me souvenais de textes relativement anciens. Les gens m'ont dit, mais comment tu sais ça? Comment pourquoi tu as ces textes en mémoire? Et je leur ai dit, mais parce que je suis né là-dedans. Et je relis ça. Je commence toujours par ce fait, donc quelqu'un m'a dit, mais tu devrais l'écrire. Je commence toujours par raconter ça parce que ça a été le déclencheur. Mais à partir du moment où j'ai commencé à écrire, je me suis rendu compte que, en fait, c'était un prétexte pour enfin essayer de comprendre mon obsession de la musique. Parce que je ne peux pas vivre sans musique, je ne peux pas vivre en silence. Donc, je suis toujours entouré de musique, toute source possible. Et donc, je suis allé au fond de l'explication, de mon explication pour la musique, une introspection que je n'avais jamais réalisée auparavant. Et de ce point de vue-là, si on prend l'aspect obsession musicale, ce texte n'est pas semi-autobiographique. Il est 100% autobiographique. C'est-à-dire que c'est mon histoire du rapport à la musique, en gros, entre 0 et 20 ans. Voilà. Et donc, la plus grande partie de mes souvenirs, vu que je suis né 3 ans avant la guerre, donc, qui a commencé en 54 jusqu'en 62, pour l'essentiel de mes souvenirs de textes, de chansons et toutes sortes de musique, vient de là. Voilà une introduction un peu plus élaborée que celle que j'ai faite la dernière fois.
Merci, Hossein. I'm going to interpret Hossein's introductory remarks, and of course, begin also by thanking Wendy's Subway and Litmus Press for launching this wonderful book. So happy to be here. So Hossein was sharing, in a way, the sort of triggering anecdote that was at the start of this book, which was simply that he, along with some friends, were sharing a meal in Paris, I presume. I'm not sure, but I think in Paris, where Hossein is currently. And there was some singing that happened after some libations, and some of the songs that Hossein and his friends were singing were very old songs. I don't know which songs exactly, but several members of the dinner table party were surprised that Hossein knew these songs and wondered, given his background, how he knew them. And so he just explained very simply, well, I was born in this music. This is the music of my childhood. And so this was for him sort of the launching moments for this kind of exploration into the sound bath that he discusses, that he writes about so movingly in this text. And it became for him a pretext to understand his obsession with music, because even today, he cannot live without music of all different kinds. So in fact, Clamor is not a semi-autobiographical text. It's really 100% autobiographical. And it is the story of his relationship to music from the ages, well, from infancy until he was about 20 years old. And of course, much of his childhood overlapped with the Algerian War from 1954 to 1962. So those were the remarks that Hossein wanted to share. I think, Teresa, unless I forgot anything, I'm going to pass the mic to you. And Teresa is going to give a bit of a translator's introduction before we go into reading the text. Hossein will be reading in French, and Teresa and I will be reading the translation in English.
Thank you, Olivia. I think you've got everything. I just want to also, on behalf of Olivia and myself, thank you so much, Hossein, for inviting us to sharing this text with us and encouraging us in our translation of it, and just being such a wonderful partner and interlocutor throughout. And I just wanted to show everyone the beautiful, beautiful book that Litmus produced with this gorgeous artwork by Julie Simon-Titeka, whom we also thank. There's also, if you don't have the book yet, there is art inside as well as on the covers. So that was actually created especially for this book. So we're very grateful to have that as well. So Olivia and I met Hossein during the 50th anniversary of the publication of Souffle en Face, which is a Moroccan cultural and political journal, a really revolutionary journal from the 1960s. We first met in Paris, where we did a reading together of the Souffle en Face anthology that Olivia and I co-edited and co-translated through Double Change, or Double Change. And then we all decamped to Rabat in Morocco, where the actual celebration took place, which was a really amazing event. And so we kind of formed a friendship there, and we've kept up a correspondence since then. So when Olivia and I read Clameur, it appealed to both of us, both in itself as a beautifully written text, a very moving text, but also as a translatable text. Because, and I'm sorry, I should say, I'm in New Orleans right now, and we're having really loud thunderstorms. So I'm sorry if that kind of interferes, but you'll just have to accept that as part of the clamor, right, of the reading. Okay, so Clamor, again, is a very translatable text because it focuses, as Amanda said, on something that's very beloved and familiar to American readers, which is Black American music. And at the same time, it introduces for American readers or Anglophone readers what may be a less familiar context, which is the Algerian War. But whether you are coming to the history of the Algerian War and the Maghreb and France's history as a former colonizer in that area, or if you're already really familiar with that history, Clamor is a very meaningful text because it's deeply in conversation with a lot of key existing texts on decolonization from Francophone North Africa, including Khattab Yassin's Nejma, Abdelkebir Atibi's Tattooed Memory, and Abdelwahab Medeb's Talismano, to name just a few. Now, these texts focus very much on the colonial landscape, but Clamor offers something unique, which Amanda also mentioned, the colonial soundscape and the unique point of view of a child living through the war. So as I mentioned before, it was a very emotionally moving text to read, but it's also incisively critical in all ways of music, of war, of colonial politics, and it's syncopated with humor. So it's a wonderfully complex text. And it was really a joy and a pleasure to translate. And Amanda did also mention the discography. So I would like to mention that again. It is really quite an exquisite playlist. So if you get a chance to see the discography and you plug it into Spotify or whatever your music app is, I really encourage you to do that. And I think it'll be really quite a wonderful experience. And Olivia, I don't know if I left anything out, but please chime in.
No, that sounds wonderful. I think we can get started and read.
Clameur, poème. Il n'est pas donné à tout le monde de naître au milieu des tripots et des terrasses de café, de la soupe musicale de la société coloniale, d'un concentré de rapaces, d'un morceau de ville tenant tout à la fois du cirque, du marché et de la caserne, et de l'inextinguible soif des hommes et des femmes de se rencontrer. Scène tant de fois revécue, C'est un enfant qui n'a pas encore 10 ans, mais qui connaît la radio avec laquelle il est né et a grandi, comme peu d'enfants de son âge. Il en connaît les sons, les voix, les sifflements, les gros boutons et l'œil vert qui maigrit ou grossit au fur et à mesure qu'on s'approche de la station choisie. Les crachotements, les notes de musique et parfois les bruitages angoissants de pièces de théâtre radiophoniques avec suspense. Ces interminables bruits de pas, ceux de l'assassin qui s'approche, ces halètements insupportables des victimes sans défense, oui, l'enfant connaît tout ça. Et c'est pour ça que ce matin-là, probablement parce que ses parents interdisent d'allumer la radio le jour, trop cher, donc ce jour-là, l'enfant se trouve chez la voisine, une seconde mère, qui l'autorise souvent à jouer dans son salon, que l'enfant s'approche de la grosse radio à œil vert, une Schneider sans doute, de taille respectable, un meuble avec ses parures de bois verni et ses baguettes de laiton doré, et qu'il entend ce chant, cette voix, cette musique qui le cloue littéralement au sol, qui le transperce, une voix de femme entre pleurs et cris de fête, un ululement fait d'amour, de désespoir et de tendresse. Tu es figé par la force de la révélation. Tu es inondé d'un immense sentiment que tu ne comprends pas, mais auquel tu ne résistes pas. Tu es dans la radio, tu es avec elle, avec cette voix, tu es avec ce personnage. Son malheur est le tien, comme le sien, comme le tien est le sien. Il n'y a pas d'autre posture possible, rien d'autre n'est envisageable. Tu viens d'intégrer cette voix dans le plus profond de ton être, même si c'est la voix la plus mystérieuse qu'il t'ait jamais été donné d'entendre. Es-tu déjà orphelin? Est-ce le garçon qui échappe un moment au giron familial, qui échappe à la vue de sa mère de quelques mètres à peine? Tu mettras plus de 10 ans à l'entendre pour la deuxième fois. Non, pour être plus précis et exprimer vraiment ce que tu ressentais pendant ces années-là, tu devrais dire que tu la chercheras vainement pendant 10 longues années, sans jamais cesser d'y penser, sans jamais écouter quelque musique que ce soit, sans penser à cette voix-là, sans que ce chant se surimpose, domine ce que tu entends, puis petit à petit s'y substitue, le cannibalise. Un chant obsédant. La scène première est celle-là. Un bloc de maisons en face d'une rue et disposé en étoile, 5 établissements. En face à gauche, le bar nègre. À droite, le tout va bien. Au bout du bloc, à gauche, le café El Beja. En face de ce dernier, le café des Aurès. Et à l'autre bout du bloc, la brasserie de l'Étoile. Raconter t'oblige à les distinguer, les évoquer séparément. Alors qu'en réalité, les haut-parleurs se font une concurrence féroce, poussée à fond, projetant aux alentours un magma sonore, de la fin de matinée jusqu'à minuit. Un vacarme douloureux fait de chants, d'instruments, d'orchestres et de solistes, de beuglantes et de mélopées, interminablement, jusqu'à devenir un magma sonore, une surimposition de si. Une guerre polyphonique, la clameur du monde. Les voix traversent l'espace, volent de mur en terrasse, puis pénètrent dans ta tête. Ta tête est antichambre, caisse de résonance. Les voix percutent les fenêtres, la pénètrent et se retrouvent piégées. Elles tournent dans un espace confiné, ta tête, la chambre, et s'en mêlent, se mélangent, toutes harmonies confondues, modulées seulement par la volonté de cet opérateur que tu ne verras jamais et qui doit tourner le bouton vers la droite, monter le volume, ou vers la gauche, baisser le volume, selon une logique aussi aléatoire qu'incompréhensible. Mais ces sons, ces voix, ces mélodies peuvent être aussi bien modulés par le vent, les vibrations de l'air ou la surchauffe du soleil.
Rosine, est-ce que tu peux couper le son, s'il te plaît?
Yeah.
Merci. Clamor, proem. Not everyone is born in the midst of gambling dens and sidewalk cafes, in the musical bath of colonial society, an aggregation of predators, a slice of the city that brings together the circus, the market, the barracks, and the inextinguishable thirst that men and women have to meet one another. A scene relived so many times. A child, not quite 10 years old, but familiar with the radio with which he was born and grew up like few children of his age. He's familiar with the sounds, the voices, the whistling, the fat buttons and the green eye that gradually thinned or thickened as one approached the chosen station, the sputtering, the musical notes, and sometimes the agonizing sound effects of suspenseful radio plays, the interminable steps of the approaching assassin, the intolerable gasps of his defenseless victims. Yes, the child knows them all, which is why that morning, probably because his parents forbade him to turn on the radio during the day, too expensive, that day, the child could be found at the house of a neighbor, a second mother who often let him play in her living room. The child approached the big radio with its green eye, a Schneider no doubt, a respectably large piece of furniture with its varnished wooden casing and its gilded brass rods, and he heard that song, that voice, that music, which literally nailed him to the floor, which ran through him, a woman's voice between weeping and celebration, an ululation made of love, despair, and tenderness. You're transfixed by the power of the revelation. You're inundated with a feeling you don't understand, but which you don't resist. You're in the radio. You're with her, with that voice. You're with that character. Her misfortunes are your own as yours are hers. No other arrangement is possible. Nothing else is imaginable. You have just integrated that voice into the most profound part of your being, even though it is the most mysterious voice you have ever heard. Are you already an orphan? Are you the boy who momentarily escapes the family hearth, out of his mother's sight by a few yards only? It would be more than 10 years before you would hear it for the second time. No, to be more precise, to truly express what you felt during those years, you should say that during those 10 long years, you would search for it in vain, never ceasing to think about it, unable to listen to any music at all without thinking of that voice, the song imposing itself, dominating everything you hear, taking its place little by little, cannibalizing it. A haunting song. The organization of a colonial city is distressingly banal, for it is conceived as a military camp. Take a city outlined by Trajan's or Caesar's cohorts. Take Pompeii, Timgad, or Volubilis. Their maps are the maps of contemporary colonial cities, the checkerboard city, drawn in straight lines that betray an obsession with quick invasions and evacuations, optimizing the flow of merchandise, small fort, and market square thinking. In its center, 2 barracks, a church, 2 schools, a synagogue, a mosque, a square flanked by a lottery shack and the broken-faced World War I veteran tending to it, a covered market, all the shops around it, a brothel street, and a multitude of watering holes. The first scene is this one. A block of houses facing a street and 5 establishments arranged like the points of a star. Across the street to the left, the Bar Nègre, to the right, the Tout va bien, and at the end of the block to the left, the El Bahja Café, across from the Ores Café, and at the other end of the block, the Brasserie de l'Étoile. To tell the story, you have to make distinctions among them, speak of them separately, while in reality, their loudspeakers were in fierce competition, pushing to the max, projecting a sonorous magma into the surroundings from late morning until just after midnight. A painful racket composed of songs, instruments, orchestras and soloists, crooners and mournful chants, interminable until it became a sonorous magma, overlapping chainsaws. A polyphonic war, the world's clamor. Voices cross space, fly over walls onto terraces, then penetrate your head. Your head is an antechamber, a resonance chamber. The voices ram the windows, penetrate them, and remain trapped there. They turn in a confined space, your head, the room, and get tangled up together, merge together all harmonies confused, modulated only by the will of an operator you will never see, who is compelled to turn the button to the right to increase the volume, or to the left to lower the volume, according to a logic as random as it is incomprehensible. But these sounds, these voices, these melodies may also be modulated by the wind, the vibrations of the air, or the overheating sun.
Dans ta mémoire qui fait sûrement une sorte de tri, des voix dominent, surpassant toutes les autres, comme Piaf qui, elle, lâche tout et gueule, excepté dans Mon homme ou dans l'hymne à l'amour. Et écrase évidemment Abdelwahab, qu'on entend neurasthénique et sans voix, et encore plus le mielleux Hafez. Et les mots d'amour, je t'aime, ahibbek, mi amor, mon amour, toi pour toujours, ressassé, sirupé, dégluti, emphasé, redit, gémi ou meuglé à l'infini. Étrangeté. Plus la chanson est en langue locale, moins il est question d'amour. Ou alors si discrètement, de façon si elliptique, si détournée, que tu te demanderas longtemps si le mot n'est audible qu'à partir d'un certain âge. L'as-tu entendu prononcer dans cette langue? Jamais. Et de quelle langue parles-tu, puisque ta langue, alors, est celle de tous les chants, n'est plus que celle de tous ces chants? Musique, bar et lupanar. Oui, on verrait bien ça en lettres de néon sur un porche monumental qui aurait pu marquer, comme une barrière d'octroi, l'entrée du centre-ville, comme l'entrée d'une enceinte de cirque. Pourquoi ce retour à cette ville où tu n'es jamais revenu, qui ne sera jamais ta ville? Pourquoi le carrefour rue Berthe, rue de Bordel, avec le bar nègre à son angle, reste-t-il le carrefour où se joueront tous tes cauchemars? Et quoi que racontent tes rêves, immanquablement, tes personnages se projettent sur cette géométrie-là. Cette topographie comme un calque supportant toutes les scènes, les douces, les violentes, les paraboles, les à peine esquissées. C'est en réalité une scène, un support remisé dans un coin de ta mémoire que tu convoques à merci. Une boîte à outils qu'on traîne avec soi parce qu'on n'éprouve pas le besoin d'en changer. Ce n'est pas une scène primordiale, pas la scène vitale, c'est la scène première. Peut-on parler de l'assiduité d'un lieu?
In your memory, which is surely performing a kind of triage, some voices dominate, surpass all others, like Edith Piaf, who unleashes all and wails, except in Mon homme or l'hymne à l'amour, and naturally triumphs over Mohammed Abdelwahab, who sounds neurasthenic and voiceless, and even more so the honeyed Abdel Halim Hafez. And the words of love, je t'aime, ahibek, mi amor, mon amour, toi pour toujours, overplayed, syrupy, swallowed, emphasized, repeated, whined or lowed to infinity. Strange, the more the song is rooted in the local language, the less it is about love, or else so discreetly, in such an elliptical fashion, so circuitously, that for ages you will wonder whether the word was only audible after a certain age. Had you ever heard it pronounced in this language? Never. And of which language are you speaking, since your language then was that of all these songs, is nothing more than the language of all these songs. Music, bars, and brothels. Yes, you can imagine it written in neon letters on a monumental porch that would mark, like an imagined border, the entry to the center of the city, like the entry to a circus. Why return to this city you never came back to, which will never be your city? Why does this intersection of Rue Berthe and the brothel street, with the Bar Nègre at its angle, remain the intersection where all your nightmares play out? And whatever your dreams recount, the characters are unfailingly projected on that geometry, that topography, a transparency carrying all the scenes, the sweet, violent, parabolic, hardly sketched out scenes. In truth, it is a scene, a prop put away in a corner of your memory that you summon at will, a toolbox that you drag along because you don't feel the need to change it. This is not the primordial scene, not the vital scene. It is the first scene. Can one speak of the constancy of a place?
Il faut de la force pour retenir ses larmes. Il en faut. Tu serres les dents, les poings, les yeux, les muscles. Tout ton corps refuse de trahir ta douleur. Tu as pu paraître indifférent alors que tu ne faisais que feindre l'impassibilité. Tu te contiens. Ton corps n'est plus qu'une grenade prête à exploser. Et enfin, tu t'éjectes, dévales les escaliers et t'éloignes à toutes jambes, aussi loin que possible du giron familial. Là, loin de tous, tu hurles ta douleur, tu deviens l'enfant hurlant sa douleur, l'enfant qui crie, l'enfant hors de lui. Il a fallu que tu sois dehors, que tu trouves ton hors là, ton désert ailleurs, que ton espace désormais soit le hors jeu. Tu t'es éjecté du cercle, de la règle. Tu ne partages pas ta douleur, car dehors, tu n'es qu'un enfant pleurant, spectacle somme toute banal dans une société livrée à la guerre. Tu as tenté de rendre supportable l'incommensurable douleur en la rendant commune, collective, publique, en la faisant fille de la rue et de la foule, ce qui ne changera rien à sa profondeur. Est-ce le miracle de la musique, ou faut-il dire celui de la voix humaine, la voix chantée? Est-ce donc ce miracle qui fait qu'un chant, un ensemble de notes, puisse frapper une personne de façon si juste, si précise, qu'elle en est à ce point bouleversée, qu'elle restera définitivement bouleversée sa vie durant par ce chant-là, avec la même intensité que la première fois? Plus encore, chaque fois que tu entends la voix de Dorothy Dandridge, le miracle se renouvelle dans ses retrouvailles. Mais il a opéré une autre transformation dans ton esprit. Jamais aucune voix de femme ne te sera indifférente. Tu pleures en entendant Janis Joplin, La Calas, Billie Holiday. Tu es le frère et l'amant de Nina Simone et toujours sur le point de te mettre à genoux en écoutant Strange Fruit, Little Girl Blue ou Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood. Tu vas t'esseler pour pleurer, te cacher pour pleurer celle que tu n'enterreras pas, que tu n'enterreras jamais. Tu t'exclus du rituel, des manifestations collectives de chagrin, des cérémonies, ou l'on t'exclut du fait de ton âge, assigné au seul souvenir, à la douleur infinie de la perte. L'enfance t'expulse du rituel. Le verbe n'est pas encore là. Il trépigne dans ta tête, il percole tout ton être. La rage à la douleur l'appelle. Il n'est plus très loin. Il sera la clé et la bouée de sauvetage, ta vitamine et ton oxygène. Tu n'as pas 7 ans et le monde t'explose à la figure. Tu n'as pas 7 ans que tu as déjà senti le souffle de la bombe, que tu apprendras à nommer plastique. Le souffle, l'onde, les débris, l'odeur, les odeurs mêlées de chair humaine, de sang, de terre et de merde. Tu n'as pas 7 ans et tu comprends que le monde est peuplé de tortionnaires et de victimes, les derniers pouvant devenir les premiers et vice-versa. Tu sauras. Tu apprendras à les connaître, les reconnaître immédiatement, à l'instant même où ils rentrent dans ton champ de vision. Tu n'as pas 7 ans, non, tu ne les as pas encore. Et tu vois les soldats en armes envahir ta maison, brutalisant ton père et ta mère, creuser des trous dans le mur pour trouver les caches d'armes, tout détruire sur leur passage. Tu n'as pas 7 ans et tu sais lire la rage dans les yeux des soldats n'ayant pas capturé le rebelle. Tu sauras aussi reconnaître la lueur de joie sadique dans les mêmes yeux pour avoir humilié une famille et démoli sa demeure. Tu n'as pas 7 ans que tu as rencontré la lâcheté. 10 ans plus tard, une cinémathèque, un festival de cinéma. Tu es devant une affiche qui annonce un film musical, ce qui n'est pas vraiment une bonne nouvelle quand on a été traumatisé par les films égyptiens, fleuves sirupeux et décervelants de l'époque. Aux États-Unis, le mouvement des droits civiques est à son apogée, tout comme les manifestations contre la guerre au Vietnam. Tu viens de lire Aimé Césaire, de découvrir Frantz Fanon et Un enfant du pays de Richard Wright. Les Black Panthers fuyant l'Amérique ne sont pas loin. Myriam Makeba vient de donner un concert et s'affiche au bras de Stokely Carmichael, flanqué de 2 gardes du corps, tout droit échappés d'un volume de Chester Himes. Et puis cet Otto Preminger, son réalisateur, est un blanc, plus blanc que les blancs américains car d'origine allemande, double tard donc. Certains critiques disent que sa représentation du noir, alcoolique, macro, infirme ou marchand de fraises, ambulant, tu hésiteras longtemps entre les fraises et les framboises, que cette image serait aux limites de l'acceptable, pas loin d'esclavagiste. Tu hésiteras donc. Mais Sidney Poitier et Sammy Davis Jr. viennent à bout de tes réticences. Plus qu'un choc, c'est un bouleversement qui se produira en toi. Tu restes cloué dans ton fauteuil, sans voix, en apnée. Il suffira des premiers plans pour que tu réalises que c'est ton chant, ta voix, celle après laquelle tu cours depuis tant d'années. C'est Summertime de George et Ira Gershwin. Les premières notes de la bande originale de Porgy and Bess. Plus tard, tu glaneras tes premiers mots d'anglais dans ce texte forcément sublime. And your mind's good looking, so hush, little baby, don't you cry. Plus tard, tu finiras par admettre que ce n'est pas Bess, Dorothy Dandridge, qui chante Summertime, mais Clara, interprétée par Diane Carroll. La rencontre devrait donc être en avril 1959, date de la sortie du film. Sûrement une diffusion sur France Inter à cette occasion. Pendant le même festival, West Side Story, encore un film musical chanté, encore un cinéma qui te guérira de la soupe égyptienne.
You need strength to hold back your tears, a lot of it. You grit your teeth, curl your fists, shut your eyes, brace your muscles. Your whole body refuses to betray your pain. You managed to look like you didn't care, but you were only pretending. You hold yourself together, hold yourself. Your body is now a grenade ready to explode. And finally, you take off, hurtle down the stairs, and run at top speed as far as possible from the family hearth. There, far away, far from everyone, you howl in pain. You become the child howling in pain, the child who screams, the child beside himself. You had to be outside so that you could find your outside, your desert, elsewhere, so that your space henceforth would be the outside, out of bounds. You projected yourself outside of the circle, the rules. You do not share your pain, for outside you are just a crying child, a banal spectacle in a society given over to war. In order to make your incommensurable pain tolerable, you turned her into a child of the streets, a child of the crowd. You made her communal, collective, public, which does nothing to change the depth of the pain. Is it the miracle of music, or rather the miracle of the human voice, the singing voice? Is this the miracle that song performs, that an ensemble of notes can strike a person so exactly, so precisely, that he is shattered, that he will remain definitively shattered for the rest of his life by that song as intensely as the first time? What's more, each time you hear the voice of Dorothy Dandridge, the miracle is renewed, but it operates another transformation in your mind. Never again will you be indifferent to a woman's voice. You will cry when you hear Janis Joplin, Maria Callas, Billie Holiday. You are the brother and lover of Nina Simone, and you are always on the verge of falling to your knees when listening to Strange Fruit, Little Girl Blue, or Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood. You will isolate yourself to cry. You will hide to cry for her, the one you will not bury, the one you will never bury. You exclude yourself from the ritual, the collective demonstrations of grief, the ceremonies. Or perhaps you are excluded because of your age, relegated to memory alone, to the infinite pain of loss. Childhood pushes you out of the ritual. The word is not there yet. It paces around in your head. It percolates through your whole being. The rage associated with pain is calling it forth. It's not far off now. It will be your key and your lifeline, your vitamin and your oxygen. You are not 7 years old, and the world explodes in your face. You are not 7 when you feel the blast of the bomb that you will learn to call plastic explosive. The blast, the wave, the debris, the smell, the mixed smells of human flesh, blood, earth, and shit. You're not yet 7, and you understand that the world is populated with torturers and victims, that the latter may become the former and vice versa. You will understand. You will learn to know them, to recognize them immediately, at the very moment they enter your field of vision. You are not yet 7, no, not yet, and you see armed soldiers invade your house, brutalize your father and mother, punch holes in the walls to find out where the weapons are hidden, destroy everything in their path. You're not yet 7 when you learn to read rage in the eyes of soldiers who haven't been able to capture the rebel. You will also learn to recognize the glint of sadistic joy in the same eyes for having humiliated a family and demolished their home. You are not yet 7 when you encounter cowardice for the first time. 10 years later, a movie theater, a film festival, you're standing in front of a poster for a musical, which doesn't bode well when one has been traumatized by Egyptian films, the syrupy, mind-numbing, interminable films of the era. In the United States, the civil rights movement is in full swing, as are the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. You've just read Aimé Césaire, discovered Frantz Fanon, and Native Son by Richard Wright. The Black Panthers are fleeing America. Miriam Makeba has just given a concert and appears on Stokely Carmichael's arm. They're flanked by 2 bodyguards who look as though they've escaped from a volume by Chester Himes. And then there's Otto Preminger, the director, who is white, whiter than American whites because of his Germanic origins, thus doubly flawed. Some critics say that his representation of the Black man, alcoholic, pimp, invalid, or strawberry hacker, you hesitate for a long time between strawberries and raspberries, that this image is almost unacceptable, that it's not so different from that of a slaveholder. So you hesitate, but Sidney Poitier and Sammy Davis Jr. assuage your doubts. It's more than a shock. You're shattered. You're nailed to your seat, voiceless, holding your breath. With the opening shots, you realize that it's your song, your voice, the one you've been chasing after all these years. It's Summertime by George and Ira Gershwin, the first notes of the original soundtrack of Porgy and Bess. Later on, you will glean your first words of English from this undeniably sublime text. And your mom is good looking, so hush, little baby, don't you cry. Later still, you will have to admit that it's not Bess, Dorothy Dandridge, who sings Summertime, but Clara, played by Diane Carroll. The first encounter must have been in April 1959, the date of the film's release, no doubt broadcast by France Inter for the occasion. During the same festival, West Side Story, another singing musical film, another film that will cure you of the Egyptian sound bath.
L'enfant se rue dehors et se met à pleurer longuement, bruyamment. Pourquoi faudrait-il que les hommes pleurent entre les murs? Est-ce que les animaux pleurent au fond de leur terrier? Tu hurles, tu cries, tu appelles, personne ne t'entend, personne ne t'attend. Tu traverses les rues parfois désertes, parfois animées, tu espères, tu crois avoir les mains tendues pour toucher, palper, caresser, mais tes bras sont ballants, inutiles, inertes. Tu n'espères plus rien. Tu n'es attendu nulle part. Personne n'est parti à ta recherche. Chacun est au plus profond de sa perte. Tu essayes de trouver du sens à ce qui arrive et ne pas comprendre aggrave ton désespoir. Tu es un enfant perdu. Tu espères comprendre. La lumière te fait mal aux yeux. Le monde est indéchiffrable. Ni la guerre, ni les murs, ni le macadam ne sont bienveillants. Tu es seul avec ta vulnérabilité et ton infinie faiblesse. Seul avec tes rêves naissants de devenir vengeur, soldat ou conquérant. Une bulle de savon, une ruse, 3 fois rien. Une brique prête de se détacher d'un vieux mur et devenir poussière. Qu'est-ce qui te sauvera? Qu'est-ce qui t'empêchera de devenir tueur, mercenaire, de vendre ton corps d'une manière ou d'une autre, d'ajouter la perte à la perte? La multitude des voix, leur vacarme, leur omniprésente, tonitruante. Longtemps, tu as pensé avoir découvert la musique grâce au fond sonore de cette rue Lupanard, avec le reste de ce qu'il y avait à apprendre et découvrir, grâce aux haut-parleurs poussés à fond des 5 cafés-brasseries. Qui te dit que tu ne les entendais pas in utero? Qui te dit qu'avant même ton premier souffle, tu n'en étais pas déjà imprégné? Oui, forcément, tu étais déjà relié au monde avant de naître. L'utérus, bénédiction, béni dans la plus belle des chambres d'enregistrement, le corps de ta mère, béni par un fleuve majestueux de sons et de voix. La musique et les voix t'auront mis au monde avant même que tu naisses. C'est ça ton secret. Une éducation musicale intra-utérine avant même que tes oreilles se forment, un héritage avant d'exister. Tu hurles encore, tu appelles. Personne ne t'attend et personne ne t'entend. Tu traverses les rues parfois encombrées, parfois seulement. Tu espères, tu touches, tu palpes, tu n'espères plus rien. Tu n'es attendu nulle part, personne n'est parti à la recherche. Tu essayes de trouver du sens à ce qui t'arrive et ne pas comprendre aggrave ton désespoir. Tu es un enfant perdu. Tu espères comprendre, la lumière te fait mal aux yeux, le monde est indéchiffrable et tu le prends à bras le corps. Qu'est-ce qui t'empêche de te perdre définitivement, de devenir un tueur, sombrer dans la démence, vendre ton corps? Les voix du monde, voix, mélodie, rythme, tous les sons t'accompagnent, te consolent, soulagent tes blessures. Tu les as accueillis et ils ont pris possession de toi. Puis vient la découverte des récits, des mots. Des mots et des notes qui t'aiguilleront vers l'impérieuse nécessité de raconter, l'ordonnancement des notes et un premier déchiffrage du chaos. Tu ne sais pas encore qu'une femme peut mourir après avoir donné la vie, accoucher et dépérir, mourir pour avoir donné la vie. Ton père, arc-bouté à ses convictions ou noyé dans son ignorance, ne jugera pas utile de faire venir un médecin ou de la faire hospitaliser. Le nouveau-né refusera de lui survivre. Plus tard, bien plus tard, tu comprendras qu'il s'agissait de septicémie foudroyante. La guerre, la vie, la mort, les ruines, les cendres, le vacarme, des camions à chenilles, les vapeurs d'alcool, le caoutchouc brûlé, le soufre. La guerre, la vie, la mort. Donner la vie et trouver la mort. L'ignorance, la bêtise, la guerre, septicémie foudroyante, foudroyance, abandonnée par son sang. Septicémie, dira la médecine. La médecine dit la médecine. La guerre, la vie, la mort, les voix, multiples, tonitruantes, vociférantes. L'enfant suivra la mère dans la mort, dans la guerre, les médecins, foudroyantes. La vie, la guerre, les champs, la mort, dessillés. La vie, vie.
The child bolts outside and begins to cry, interminably, loudly. Why should men cry behind walls? Do animals hide in their burrows to cry? You howl, you scream, you call out. No one hears you. No one is waiting for you. You cross empty streets, busy streets. You're hopeful. You imagine that your hands are outstretched to touch, feel, caress, but your arms are slack, useless, inert. You lose all hope. No one is waiting for you. No one has come looking for you. Everyone is in the depths of loss. You are trying to make sense of what is happening to you, but you can't, and your despair only grows greater. You are a lost child. You wish you could understand. The light hurts your eyes. The world is indecipherable. Neither war nor walls nor concrete do you any good. You are alone with your vulnerability and your infinite frailty, alone with your budding dreams of becoming an avenger, a soldier, or a conquistador. A bubble of soap, a trick, next to nothing, a brick that threatens to fall from an old wall and become dust. What will save you? What will keep you from becoming an apprentice killer, a mercenary, from selling your body in one way or another, from adding loss to loss? The multitude of voices, their racket, their omnipresence, resounding. For a long time, you felt you had discovered music, along with everything that was to be learned and discovered, thanks to the sound bath of this brothel street, thanks to the loudspeakers blaring at full volume from these 5 cafes. Is it possible that you heard them in utero, that before your very first breath, you had already imbibed this music? Yes, of course, you were already connected to the world before birth. The blessed uterus, you were blessed in the most beautiful recording chamber, your mother's body, blessed by a majestic river of sounds and voices. Music and voices gave birth to you before you were born. That is your secret. An intrauterine musical education before your ears were fully formed, a bequest before existing. You howl again, you call out. No one is waiting for you and no one hears you. You cross occasionally congested streets. You're hopeful, you touch, you feel, and you lose all hope. No one is waiting for you. No one has come looking for you. You are trying to make sense of what is happening to you, but you can't, and your despair only grows greater. You are a lost child. You wish you could understand. The light hurts your eyes. The world is indecipherable and you take it in your arms. What will keep you from losing yourself entirely, becoming a killer, plunging into madness, selling your body? The world's voices. Voices, melodies, rhythms, all these sounds accompany you, console you, assuage your wounds. You welcomed them in and they have taken possession of you. And then you discover stories, words and notes that will orient you to the imperious need to tell stories. The ordering of notes is a first attempt to decipher the chaos. You don't yet know that a woman can die after giving life, give birth and perish, die for having given life. Out of blinded conviction or profound ignorance, your father doesn't see why he should call a doctor or bring her to the hospital. The newborn refuses to survive her. Later, much later, you will understand what it was, raging septicemia. War, life, death, ruins, ashes, the racket of caterpillar trucks, alcohol fumes, burnt rubber, sulfur. War, life, death, giving life and finding death. Ignorance, stupidity, war, raging septicemia, raging, abandoned by her blood. Septicemia, says medicine. Medicine says medicine. War, life, death, voices, multiple, resounding, vociferating. The child will follow the mother in death. In war, the doctors, raging, life, war, songs, death, eyes open, life, live, Thank you. Merci.
Merci infiniment. Merci, merci beaucoup. Je suis très ému.
Thank you so much for the reading, all three of you. I would love to hear actually all three of you talk about the mode of address, the second person, especially hearing the reading both in French and English, just the registering the impact of that decision to use second person throughout the text. So I'd love, Hossein, to hear you talk about that as the author, but then I know as in translation as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that I think that'd be interesting to hear
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
Vas-y, Hossein, go. Et j'interprète ce que ta réponse. Donc, c'est par rapport à l'adresse à la seconde
La
personne.
traduction?
Je ferai la traduction, ouais.
Non, je veux dire, je suis pas sûr d'avoir compris la question.
D'accord, pardon. Ok, donc la question, c'est par rapport à l'usage du tu, en fait, de la seconde personne du singulier. Et qu'est-ce qui a informé ta décision? Parce que tu aussi trouves qu'il y a un impact, en fait, surtout à l'écoute, très fort, quand on entend cette adresse à la deuxième personne. Et elle voulait savoir un peu plus ce qui avait motivé cette décision et ce que tu en pensais toi-même.
Oui, je pense que à un moment, j'ai dû sentir la nécessité de dialoguer avec cet enfant. Je crois que je n'aurais pas supporté émotionnellement de tout raconter avec je à la première personne. Et donc, il fallait que je crée une distance. Et puis le tu, ça a une puissance importante parce que tu interroges ce double et du coup, ça te permet de formuler des questions que tu n'aurais pas formulées si tu avais dit je de bout en bout. Alors, ça, c'est, je dirais, une raison je dirais psychologique, mais c'est aussi un problème d'écriture et qu'il faut prendre comme tel. C'est-à-dire que c'est bien une façon de faire littérature. Parce que je ne suis pas sûr qu'on puisse, dans un texte de cette nature, si autobiographique, aller dans le jeu très très loin. Donc c'est à la fois une position psychologique, mais aussi une position d'écriture. Et je voulais me donner la liberté d'écrire jusqu'au bout. Voilà.
Merci, super intéressant. So I'll just interpret into English, even though I think a lot of you understand what Hossein was saying, but that, first of all, it was important for him emotionally to create a distance between himself and the child who had experienced these events. It would have been too difficult to write in the first person. And so there's a psychological reason for choosing the second person, and I should say singular. In French, you can address, I'm sure many of you know this, most of you know this, but you can address a person in the tu singular form or in the vous plural form, and tu, it would be more appropriate for a child. So it's very intimate. It's a very intimate form of address, but it still created this distance for Hossein. But secondarily, he also sees it as a question of writing, a decision motivated by the constraints of writing, you could say, because he wasn't sure that he could go as far in a text that was already so autobiographical with the first person singular, with the je. Saying I, that it might have in a way limited how far he could go. So both psychologically, but also in terms of writing practice.
I think it's so fascinating because also the moment in the text where the narrating the child going out into the street with the grief, that kind of doubling of the doubling and the distance. I mean, I think it's it's really beautiful and very intense, but I think, as you're saying, it allows you to go farther in a way, but very literally going out into the street and to the communal kind of pain and grief. So yeah.
I would even add, and I don't know if this is necessarily related to translation, but I think it also creates more intimacy with the reader. Because the reader is reading also in the second person. And so the reader is, in a way, shadowing Hosein's own relationship to himself as a young child. So there's a very intense process of identification in reading a text addressed in the second person, which of course is, I would say, more common in French than in English. And that was a decision that Teresa and I were committed to taking. Teresa, do you want to speak more about the translation?
I'm not sure that I would have more to add about it. I do agree. Obviously, it has a really powerful effect. I might actually just indulge in a personal anecdote, which is that my father's mother, my grandmother, died during World War II, not of septicemia, but of she died in childbirth because she'd had rheumatic fever, which weakens the heart, which is something that doesn't really happen now, but is something that happened then. So, and my father was 7 years old. So when I read this, you know, first in French and then translating, I mean, every time, and then I read it when we do readings, and it's very moving. And I really have a hard time not breaking down into tears because it's just so moving. But, you know, I mean, it really speaks to me about all of these, you know, kind of stories from the global South, stories from, you know, colonies, former colonies of things that have happened to people, right, that don't get told. So there's a way in which, Hossein, you are actually telling one of my family's stories too, or I can hear that story through your story. So I think the second person has a lot to do with that. So.
C'est la première fois que j'entends ça.
Oui, c'est la première fois que je vous dis tout ça, mais Olivia et toi, mais bon.
Okay, je comprends la lecture. Non, alors juste pour aller pour continuer la pensée de Tracy, je crois que ces scènes-là de l'enfant dans la rue, je ne suis jamais venu à bout de ces scènes-là. C'est-à-dire que j'ai toujours été incapable de les raconter. Donc, ce qu'il y a dans ce texte, c'est une parcelle. C'est-à-dire que pour moi, ça a été un événement tel que, je ne sais pas, on prend peut-être une vie pour raconter ça. Et là, l'écriture ne rend que partiellement compte de l'événement lui-même tel que je l'ai perçu pendant mon enfance. Et c'est vrai que la douleur dans la solitude, c'est ce qu'il y a de pire au monde. Et alors vous ajoutez la douleur de la solitude pendant la guerre, voilà, c'est un condensé particulier.
So Hossein was just adding that, in fact, he feels even in the writing, he's never gotten to the end or reached the bottom of those passages where he's describing the child wandering in grief, all alone in the streets with the war, you know, raging around him. He's never been able to actually either, you know, in his own thinking or in his writing, to truly get to the bottom of that. And so what's in the book is, even though it is so moving, it's just a tiny, tiny part of something much bigger that perhaps it takes an entire life to reach the end of.
Yes, well, and I was thinking, right, how do you reach the end of that? And especially when it remains so completely present and ongoing, given, you know, current events now, and that the you in that way also keeps it present, because any, you know, if you're reading it and being addressed, that kind of implication, I think is really important as well. Yeah. Does anybody, are there questions from any of the folks listening? Or, I mean, I have other thoughts, but I don't need to dominate. Or if there's anything in particular, Teresa and Olivia or Hossein, that you wanted to talk about as well.
You know what? I wanted to give a shout out to Amiel and the audience. Yes. Thank you for your beautiful blurb. And also thank you, Pierre, if you're watching on YouTube or will watch in the future, Pierre Joris. We have these amazing blurbs from these two wonderful poets. So thanks.
I just wanted to ask a little question because I'm always so curious about process, and I guess this question would be more for you, Olivia, and Teresa, because so I think it makes sense for me that a book like Clamor is translated by multiple voices, and yeah, to I think just together the polyvocalness of the text itself. But I guess I'm just interested in what your process was like in like having those conversations, like both translating the same text. Like, was it a kind of back and forth, or like, yeah, what were those conversations like, or this collaboration?
Teresa and I are always looking for something to translate together because we love the process. And we, as I think you were mentioning in your introduction, we did an anthology in translation, so an anthology in English from the French and Arabic language journal Souffle, and also Enfes, the Arabic version. And that was even more collaborative in the sense that Teresa and I translated, we edited, but then we had, I think, 18 or 17 other translators, some of whom attended today. And it is wonderful to see some of the translators here. So shout out as well to the Souffle team. And so our process for Clamor, and I mean, I think Josine, we met you at the same time. It sort of was a perfect match, and it was dans le sillage, right, in the continuation of our work on Souffle. Josine, as I mentioned, published in Souffle as well, and so it felt like a very organic process. But in terms of the nuts and bolts of it, usually Teresa and I will kind of divide the text, and so we'll each, for example, I'll take part 1, she'll take part 2, I'll take part 3, and so on. And then we'll read each other's translations and edit. So we're also editing each other's work and having conversations, sometimes debates, about certain choices. So in a way, it's very time consuming, but it's also very gratifying because we literally discuss every single decision, from like verb tenses to, the words that we choose. We'll make sure that, for example, I'm trying to think of a word that comes up at several points, but expressions or words that come back in the text that we're translating it the same way, even though we might have each translated one part. So that's, I don't know if you want to add anything, Teresa, but it feels a very like organic and seamless process. And it does feel good to have multiple voices because, as those of you who translate know, translation is about deciding, right? You have to make a decision. You have to come to what you consider to be the best decision. And so it's actually really nice to have someone to bounce off ideas on and, in a way, kind of confirm your choices or nuance them, right? To have that, in a way, quality check every step of the way. It's a bit scary to translate by yourself sometimes because you're the one deciding. There's no one else to kind of say, hey, yeah, this sounds good, or I think this is better,
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I had someone recently ask me how I've worked to, translating with a partner. It was someone who was about to translate with a partner for the first time. And I just said, it's so much easier in a certain way than translating by yourself because you're not, it is, like you said, it can be really lonely, like writing, right? But now, there is always a dialogue. And I would also say it's really fun. The dialogue takes place in a lot of different technologies and in a lot of different ways, right? So there's a lot going on in email, but then also in track changes, like that's where a lot of the work is going on, and that's true, I think, with writers and translators and their editors. And then, sometimes we do have face-to-face conversations, or like, over Skype or Zoom or the phone or whatever. So there's also like different layers. It's like a palimpsest of a conversation that moves forward. And I think at one point we were working on, actually through most of our work on the Souffle Enfes anthology, we had a Google Doc. I don't know if it still exists, but I mean, it's really long, just of like our to-do, like that wasn't even translational choices necessarily. That was just like things we needed to do, like practical things. And we should try to find that sometime. It would be really interesting to kind of break down the process, because at the time when you're translating something, right, you're just thinking, okay, well, what's the next step? What's the next step? But to actually break it down, and like we actually have a record of what we did and the process we went through. And I think that could be useful for thinking about, especially larger larger scale projects. But I think, just being able to take it step by step with another person is really helpful. And I would, I guess, also just say, when translating by myself, I also don't really feel when I do like I'm translating something by myself right now, I don't necessarily feel like I'm alone. I do feel like I could reach out to Olivia or to whomever. I have a translation workshop group I meet with virtually right now once a month. So I think this is true for writers too, right? Not just translators. So that's what I have to say.
Est-ce que je peux dire un mot sur un apport de Teresa Olivia, très important, puisque c'est un texte sur la musique. À un moment de nos discussions, elles ont proposé qu'on mette une discographie. Donc c'est un ouvrage qui comprend aussi une partie sonore, si on veut. C'est très important. Voilà, donc on peut à la limite aller vers les sons dont il est question dans le texte. Voilà, ça me semble très important. Et c'est grâce à Teresa Olivia.
Yeah, so Hossein was just adding that one particularity of this translation is that it includes a discography, which allows you to go to the music. And I should actually, well, I think it was actually Tracy's idea, or I can't remember, but in one of our conversations, we thought that given the importance of music in the text, we would really like to include a discography. And I believe, Tracy, we are still in conversation about having a digital publication that would include digital files. So we'd have an actual discography linked as well that you could actually click through.
Well, did we ever discuss the Spotify a public playlist? I don't know why we wouldn't do that in the meantime. I love that idea of just sort of being able to put it on and have it shuffle. I think that's an important thing when Hossein's preface to that, to say that there's nothing linear about, even though in the text there's a list as of the music, but I think it's crucial that there's nothing linear about listening to those the music, and so there's yes, but we did talk about an eventual digital publication, which I think makes so much sense, to sort of continue to open up the work and the different registers that it is operating on. Yeah. I would love to, yeah, maybe we can chat a little bit more, and but I would love to hear from Hossein about the artwork, and that's not the artwork came to us, but that's not something I've discussed a lot with all of you, in terms of how the artwork came to be and what that relationship between Julie's artwork and the text, and I would love to hear about that as well.
C'est une histoire d'amitié et de hasard. J'avais commencé à demander à plusieurs amis peintres de me faire des propositions. Et donc, j'ai eu 4-5 propositions et qui ne me semblaient pas convenir, qui n'étaient pas à la hauteur du texte. Et puis, Julie, que je connais depuis longtemps, une amie, de temps en temps, je voyais ses dessins sur Facebook. J'ai découvert les dessins que vous avez sur Facebook d'abord. Et donc, je lui ai téléphoné, je lui ai dit, mais est-ce que tu m'autorises à les utiliser dans le cadre de la publication de Clamart? Elle m'a dit, mais bien sûr. C'est comme ça. Et elle avait une série limitée dans ce style-là. Elle fait beaucoup de choses. Si vous regardez sur Facebook, elle fait de très belles choses. Mais cette série très colorée, en fait, ça a été une série limitée. Je crois qu'elle en a 5 ou 6. Pas plus que ça. Voilà, donc c'est l'amitié et le hasard.
I can take
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So Hossein was just saying that it's a story of friendship and also of chance, right? Of things happening at random. So he had asked several artist friends for a few proposals, and he didn't find them at all appropriate to the text. And then he was just looking at Julie's Facebook page, and they've been friends for a really long time. And he saw these drawings and he asked her, may I use them for my book? And she said, of course. It's a very limited series. They're very colorful. And so that's kind of how that happened.
And I think there's also another interesting point is that Julie grew up in Morocco and studied at the Fine Arts Institute of Rabat. So there's also, I think, a Maghrebi connection. I don't know if, est-ce que tu la connaissais au Maroc?
Oui, je l'ai connue au Maroc et surtout, une fois qu'elle est rentrée qu'elle a quitté le Maroc pour s'installer en France, on s'est beaucoup vu. Donc, voilà, c'est quelqu'un que j'aime beaucoup. J'aime beaucoup son style de dessin et donc c'était parfait, quoi. Ça a matché pour parler en français.
I wanted to also add something. So, basically saying it was a perfect fit, and I agree aesthetically, the images, I don't know, it's almost as if they were made for this text. So when we saw them all, we thought, my goodness, this is perfect. This is exactly what we wanted. And I just wanted to add that it's part of our process also. Teresa and I and Hossein had talked about what images, or if we would want to include images in this publication, a long time ago. And initially, I was curious to see if Hossein could find anything in his personal archive related to the music, for example, disc jackets or, cover, I don't know what you would call it, but the art, iconography that comes with the music, or family photographs or photographs of Biskra, the town where he grew up in. And I think, Hossein, you found a few, not your own images, but you found some kind of Orientalist postcards of Biskra, which are quite evocative images as well. And then we sort of had a conversation, and I think one of the things that I was keen not to do was I didn't want to make the illustrations indexical. I didn't want them to be illustrations, actually, like, oh, this is where he grew up, and it seemed much more fitting to have almost abstract, they're not, they're figurative, but to have images that would echo with, right, to use that musical metaphor, with the text in less indexical ways. So that was sort of the itinerary for finding the images. And then you showed us the images of Julie's work, and they were just perfect.
Well, any other points you all want to bring up, or any other thoughts about either process or the book itself, or origins of the text? Anything that? Well, it's been really so lovely to be able to have this conversation with you all after the whole being in process with the book so intensely. I think to really be able to dive into it now. And so thank you so much for reading and conversation. And thank you again, Wendy Subway, and everybody who tuned in.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe just as a sort of teaser pour la suite, Hossein, est-ce que tu veux nous parler d'un projet en cours? I wanted to ask Hossein if he has anything in the works that might come out in English at some point.
J'ai plusieurs projets en cours, mais comment dire, mais j'ignore comment les appeler. Je ne sais pas s'ils vont relever plus de la fiction ou d'une écriture poétique. Je suis entre les deux. En tout cas, je pense qu'avec le roman que je viens de publier, ainsi que tous les hommes, j'ai fait un gros travail sur la fiction, et donc je pense que je vais faire une pause là-dessus. Mais voilà, j'ai plusieurs textes en chantier, mais je ne sais pas comment les classer, comment les nommer, et je crois même pas que je suis capable d'en parler. Désolé.
So Hossein is indeed working on several projects, but he's not sure what to call them. It might be poetry, it might be prose. He just published a novel, I think his third novel, so he's probably going to verse more towards poetry, but it's a bit too soon to speak of it publicly.
Voilà.
Merci infiniment.
Ok. Merci, Hossein. Yeah.
Subway, pardon. Merci à eux. Bonsoir.
Bonsoir. Ciao.
Bye. Thank you all for coming so much. See you in the real world soon, I hope.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Bye. Take care.